Welcome to the acoustic guitar build video. We bought the kit from the US and it was delivered to Australia within a week. Having never built an acoustic guitar before and having none of the right tools, I wasn't sure how this was going to go. A number of instructional manuals were included in the kit, some of these were even life-size. And it even came with an instructional DVD that was made no later than the year 2000. The first step was to glue the sides together using the tail block and the neck block. We had to make sure that the sides were square when we were doing this so the guitar wouldn't go out of shape, and then use many clamps and leave to dry overnight. Also, as part of this step, we had to create a custom mold to keep the sides in shape, and I just did this using a bit of leftover MDF we had laying around. The next step was to put the kerfings around the sides. These were little wooden strips that would allow the sides to grip with the top and back of the guitar later when we glue them on. We also had to leave about a 1mm overhang so that later on when we sand them down we could get the perfect fit between the top and the back. When the kerfings were glued on nicely, we had to cut out the neck pocket hole before we could do anything else. Next, we had to measure and cut grooves in the kerfing so that when the top and back go on, the bracings fit into these grooves and give the guitar its strength. Next, we started on the soundboard, the top of the guitar, and the first step here was to glue the rosettes into the top. This seemed like the easy first step to take, so we chose that. After this, we found ourselves at the first major challenge, and that was doing the bracings for the top and back of the guitar. The instructions came with full-size plans. Using these and some creative solutions, we were able to trace the bracing patterns onto the back and top of the guitar. Just kidding, Elaine did all of this.
Because it's nice to have a helping hand.
It was now time for me to do a 1-year chisel course in 6 hours with no undo button. To do the bracings right, the first step was to do the X bracing in the middle and then shape all other pieces of wood to fit under this. This meant chiseling out grooves under the X brace for all other pieces of wood to fit into so that the guitar had more strength. The back of the guitar is curved, so when it came to glue the back bracings on, we had to make custom cauls. These cauls upheld the back's curve. When we'd finished gluing all the bracings, I spent many hours chiseling so that they would fit into the grooves of the kerfings on the sides of the guitar. And finally, it was time to check if the neck was square before we could glue the top on. It wasn't until about this point when we thought we could actually pull this off. With the top glued on, it was looking so good it was hard to believe. Before we could glue the back on, we had to do some more bracing by putting some reinforcement strips on the sides. Time to glue the back. Because the back of the guitar was curved, we had to make a 5-degree wedge for when we glued it to the sides. You might be wondering what these dodgy clamps we're using are. Well, let me tell you. In the almighty instructional DVD from vintage times, the luthiers had the luxury of using specialised clamps, the kind you need to rob a bank to afford. In the digital age, I don't know where any physical banks are, so instead I took a trip to Bunnings, and we made some cylindric clamps out of anything we could find. With the body together, it was time to do the most nerve-wracking part, take a router to the edges. When we first set out on this guitar build, I wasn't too worried about how it was going to turn out, or if it failed. But now that we'd gotten so far and it looked so good, I was quite worried about this step. At this point, I didn't even own a router, so I did the most sensible thing that you could do. Bought the cheapest router I could find at Bunnings. Ozito. I was so worried about tear out that I did a climb cut for every section of the guitar. We needed to route the guitar for a few reasons. One, to trim off the overhang that came with the top and the back in the kit. And two, to route the binding channels. There were 2 binding channels on the top to route. One was about 1mm deep, one was about 4mm deep, and on the back there was only 1 channel. We used spare pieces of the bindings to set the router depth. When we were satisfied that the router was set at the right depth, we routed all of the edges. Turns out, routing is quite easy and very satisfying. In fact, it went so well that we had a newfound enthusiasm for finishing the guitar. After the binding channels were cut, we glued the bindings on. The inner binding on the top was wood, so we used wood glue. The white plastic bindings, we used CA glue. And masking tape was enough to clamp these on. Onto the neck. The first step for the neck was to set up the groove for the truss rod. I had to measure and glue a wood plug into the truss rod channel near the headstock. Then chisel and sand the plug flat. And after this, I put an ebony veneer on the headstock. We now had to do the fretboard. The fretboard came as a solid slab of ebony. We had to trim about 1/2 inch off the edges and taper it to fit along with the neck. The fret grooves are already cut into it, and once I was happy with the shape, I put the frets on. They gave us a piece of fretboard to practice on first. I just trim the edges off with pliers and later we'll file them down. Possibly the most tedious step of the whole guitar was doing the fretboard inlays. These were diamond inlays and Elaine did this with an engraver over 4 days. This took so long we did many other steps during the process. Once the fretboard was done, it was time to glue the fretboard on. Instead of using clamps, we had a rubber band that was included with the kit. Once the fretboard was glued on, there was still a clean-up job with razor blades to get the fretboard to fit perfectly with the neck. Keen to get the neck onto the body at this point, we slapped in the dot inlays on the top of the fretboard. The clear hardest step of the whole guitar was shaping the neck pocket. We spent days trying to chisel out this neck pocket and we still didn't get it absolutely perfect by the end. I won't go into the technicalities about how this was done, but trust me, for an amateur, this was hard. Before we glued the neck on, we had to do some really precise measurements for the intonation. We had to make sure that the strings were going to sit nicely over where the fretboard was positioned, and we had to make sure that the 12th fret was almost exactly halfway between the bridge and the nut where both sides of the strings touch. When we were satisfied with the positioning, we glued the bridge on. I also had to make 3 custom calls to do this, 2 that sat on top of the bridge and 1 inside the guitar where the clamps would touch. The call inside the guitar had to be cut so that it navigated the bracing patterns also. With the neck and bridge glued on, it was time to do a few small tasks before we could string it up. Drilling tapered holes for the bridge pins. Sanding down the saddle to the right height. Filing all of the frets down. And putting the tuning pegs on. The instructions said to lacquer the guitar before doing any of these steps, but I wanted to make sure that this guitar was going to work and be worth the effort. I also hadn't shaped the neck, so I strung the guitar up to see if it would work and then shaped the neck with the strings on. I may have been called a cowboy by a real luthier. Finally, it looked like the guitar was done and it was time to sand it down, dye the top, and lacquer it. The guitar was sanded through various grades of sandpaper until it was smooth. Wood grain raises when it gets wet, so we slightly wet the guitar and then sanded it down again to avoid this when the lacquer goes on. We wanted the top to be slightly darker than the colour it came in, so we tested many dyes on spare bits of wood that came with the kit until we were happy with the colour. After umming and ahhing about which lacquer to use and scrolling through several forums, I ended up getting the Toxic Nitro and a full body suit to accompany it. It took several coats under the right conditions to get all of the lacquer on. After waiting 3 weeks for the lacquer to cure, it was finally complete.